Welcome to the inaugural Canada-Africa Investment Symposium at the Toronto Global Forum. I'd like to thank the entire team at the International Economic Forum of the Americas for supporting this platform, created for the sole purpose of expanding discourse between the two markets. The purpose of the conversation is to illuminate an excellent, potentially overlooked opportunity to ensure that Canadian business engages with the continent of Africa, notably the fastest growing global economy and vice versa. It is critical that Canada engage in the conversation that our G7 peers are already established in. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Templar Kalundu. I'll be around. Enjoy.
Hi, good morning, and welcome to the Canada-Africa Investment Symposium. We're glad to have you here for this really dynamic and engaging conversation. So thank you for the audience for attending, for those of us in person, for those of us attending virtually, and ultimately to our esteemed panel. So welcome. So to get started, I'd love to introduce you to our panel members. We have directly to my left, Mr. Goldy Hyder. He is the CEO and President of the Business Council of Canada. And we also have the honor of having Dr. Eleni Gabre-Madhin joining us. And she is the Chief Innovation Officer and Regional Bureau of Africa for the United Nations Development Fund. We also have the Honorable Robert Oliphant joining us, and he's the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs. And we have Mehdi Filali. He is the Vice President of Farmer Solutions at OCP Africa. And last but definitely not least, we have Mr. Isaac Olawalafi. He is the General Partner of BKR Capital. So welcome.
Thank you.
So Templar did a really great introduction to really understand the discourse and the conversation that we are having. This is a conversation that is extremely timely. It is a conversation that is being held in many different areas across the world, in the Caribbean, in the US, and it's a great opportunity for Canada to step forward into the discourse. So as we know, we've become increasingly aware of these conversations, and I just think it would be helpful to just kind of ground ourselves in some basic facts that we are all probably generally aware of, but it's helpful that we're on the same page. So we know that the African continent is one of the world's fastest growing economies. We also might be aware that it's going to represent 1/4 of the world's population by 2050 at almost 2.5 billion people. It's also one of the youngest in terms of population, has a significant growing middle class. There are infrastructure investment opportunities and a high digital adoption rate. So all things sound for trade and investment. So hence the conversation. So I'd like to open this with a question for all our panel members. And Goldy, perhaps I can start with you to answer first. But it's clear that the African continent represents many growth and investment and trade opportunities. But what is it about this current reality that might not be connecting for businesses in Canada and in the African continent to build a stronger trade and investment relationship?
Well, thank you for the opportunity to be here, and good morning to you all. Just by irony, I'm about to go to have lunch and be seated at the head table with a person who made this statement famous, which is, you don't go to where the puck is, you go to where the puck is going to be. And I'm speaking, of course, of Wayne Gretzky. And I think that's exactly the analogy of what we can use here for Africa. We at the Business Council of Canada released a report February 2020, rather timely. It got lost in the last 2 years, but I think it can be resuscitated with a panel like this as to why Africa. And you just said it yourself. Those statistics, those facts are extremely important. And we're living in an era of a number of things. One is the importance of a narrative and the story. And we've got to change the frame in which Africa has been seen. And there is such a great story to tell. So that's the first thing I would just stress is how to tell that story. Secondly, it's Africa, but there's parts of this, you have to understand all of Africa. It's not just one place. And so you've got to treat it the way sometimes people say Canada has to be treated. We're one country, but really we have many different parts to it. So understanding that is key. Thirdly, I would say that money follows message. If you get your message right, money will come. I mean, when you were speaking, I wanted to say sold. Like, I'm ready to go. Like, let's do this, because the opportunities just speak for themselves and money will follow. Which brings me to I think the more important point is to your context of currently what's happening is the world is fundamentally changing. It is not going to be going back to what was. It is now what is and what might be as we go forward. We don't know what that is. And so the moment here that we find ourselves as Canadians to be able to respond to the world's need for energy, for food, for critical minerals. My good friend Senator Black was alluding to the importance of getting infrastructure to get it out to market. World is realigning, if you heard Chrystia Freeland's speech on this whole notion of friendshoring and nearshoring, that's the moment in which we need to look at the world differently and say, who has what? Who can get whom to what? And how do we build a supply chain that creates confidence and integrity that is reassuring to the customer, reassuring to business, and reassuring to governments and regulators that there's a rule of law, that there's trade agreements, and I think this is the opportunity for Africa for having negotiated a free trade agreement that now we can work with and kind of latch on to. So really low-hanging fruit, but as in everything else, you got to do something, you got to act. You can't just talk about it.
Great. Thank you for that. Dr. Eleni, maybe I can open the question for you. What do you think may not be connecting for businesses in Africa and the African continent about the opportunities to build a stronger trade and investment relationship?
Thank you, Sherry. Thank you, everyone. It's really lovely to be here in Toronto. And I noticed that the theme is charting a new economy. And I really feel that that is on point for Africa. We are on the cusp of, and have been really leading up to what my colleague Goldy just called a moment. And I've been actually referring to this moment as Africa's moment. And I'll tell you why. In addition to some of the statistics that Sherry shared, we have had, I would say, two things that have been almost land shifts, geological shifts, if you will, on the continent. The first is the ratification of the Africa Free Trade, the Continental Free Trade Area, AFCFTA, which opens up a $3.2 trillion market. Obviously, it's not happening overnight. There is a process, but the potential is enormous. The second is that the last 2 decades, and my background before joining UNDP was in the private sector, and before that I was an economist at the World Bank. So going back to my policy wonk days, the last 2 decades of investment in education and health has yielded an enormous dividend. That not only do we have this big youth bulge, as we all talk about all the time, but that it's an increasingly educated, tech-savvy, aspiring youth. Half of the world's labor force will be youth by 2050. Will be African by 2050. Half of the world's mobile users will be African by 2050. These are enormous areas of potential. And so what we've seen in the last 5 years, and especially in the last 2 years, is this explosion of venture capital financing coming into Africa. In 2021, year on year, the growth was 253%, growing 3 times as much as the global growth in venture capital going into innovation and startups. This year, the VC has sort of slowed down globally, but in Africa, we're still going strong, going from what we reached 5 billion last year to what's projected to 8 billion in 2022. So again, what's going on? And by the way, I should mention 60% of that is from North America. I haven't teased out the statistic for Canada, but my suspicion is that Canadian venture capital is flowing into Africa, and there will be more coming. And so that's, to me, the real opportunity, is innovation driven by tech-savvy youth entrepreneurs, innovators who are plugging into this massive Pan-African market in an increasingly digital continent.
Great, thank you. Robert, how would you like to add your comments to this dialogue?
I don't. Thank you, and I'm not going to repeat what my colleagues have said, but starting out thanking the Toronto Global Forum for having this panel, and that is one step. because Africa isn't always on the radar for business and for investment and for all of us. And getting this panel and getting you creatively thinking about opportunities is one of those first steps. And I don't think we start from a neutral position. I don't think that Canada understands Africa very well. And I think that there's still a mentality in Canada at looking at the needs of Africa and the challenges of Africa and the problems of Africa instead of the opportunities and gifts of Africa. And so changing that mentality is something that we have to do. Of course, we have the economic engines of Africa. We have Morocco and Nigeria and Egypt and South Africa as the larger economies of the continent. But we also have smaller and emerging economies that are finding ways to do business in creative and open and exciting ways, like Rwanda, opening up business in a new way. Ghana, Kenya are countries that are emerging economies. I also look at it from the aspect of Canada's need. Look at us. We're old. Some company excluded from that. We're an aging country. We have a high age bubble that is out of the baby boom, and we need markets. We need investment opportunities. We need the youth and the imagination, the innovation of Africa to sustain Canadian growth. It's not a case of Africa just needing us. We need Africa. Those 54 countries of Africa are important opportunities for investment. I was really glad that the Africa Continental Free Trade Area was mentioned, because what that also does is embed a rules-based order into the trade of African countries, into the regional economic communities, into the individual countries, and into the companies. Because what Canadian businesses want is predictability. We want safety. We want good governance. We want all of that. And we will do that through our responsible business practices, but we're looking for help from Africa as well. We're on the radar. I am in Africa all the time and want to keep being there, and I want you to come with me.
Thank you. And thank you for the invitation. So I hope you guys all heard that, right? So, okay, great. Mehdi, your thoughts?
Yes. First, I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to be here and to speak, to represent OCP, which is an African company. OCP is a fertilizer manufacturer that is leading in the world, but we have special focus on Africa, and we have dedicated a company that is called OCP Africa to support the development of the agriculture in the continent. I think there is a great opportunity for Canadian companies in the continent in various sectors. In agriculture, in precision agriculture, in agribusiness, in agro-industry, in energy, in hydro, power energy, in solar energy, and so on, and infrastructure. So the potential is here. We see also that there is a good framework that exists, that has been signed between Canada and the 10 sub-Saharan African countries, plus Egypt, which is the FIPA, Foreign Investment Protection Promotion Agreements. So this framework exists. Now, the potential to increase the trade and the investment is great, is very big. I think if we compare Canada to the international competitors, the trade with Africa is still below US or China or Europe. The investment in the continents are mainly focused on mining sector, knowing that the potential is here in all the sectors that I say. I think one of the solutions is to empower the partnership between Canadian companies and African companies like the one that I represent, and we have the willingness to work with Canadian companies, because it will also help to mitigate the risk. The Canadian companies will work with companies that have already a footprint in the continent, in different countries, that are working with the local ecosystem, and that can help to identify these opportunities and also to mitigate the different risks. And I think it can be one of the solution, and it will be helpful to leverage all the technology of Canada And we know that the human resources of Canada, it's a very strong point. And this could be helpful by combining and leveraging this expertise with also the footprint of local players. And by combining both of them, we can have very good, I think, result on developing the trade investment between Canada and Africa.
Thank you. Yeah, and I really loved your articulation of the need for partnership between locals so that, for those organizations that are feeling or resistant to some of the potential risks, that they can mitigate that. Thank you for sharing that. Isaac, your thoughts?
Thank you. And again, it's great to be here on this panel with my colleagues and allies in this great conversation. And it's good to be able to represent not only the next generation, but also understanding what the previous generation has done. And at BKR Capital and at Dreammaker as a whole, what we've been working on doing is bridging that gap of understanding. And I think representation is so key. Just like this panel right here, representation from the continent, representation from different countries within the continent, representations from government, representations from chambers. Because what it does, it brings different perspective. It allows us to share ideas, resources, know-hows, and then create new strategies. When you think of the continent, it's understanding the economic landscape and understanding every country has a different stage of their economic growth. And from Canada's perspective is understand what are our strengths and what solutions may we be able to solve, but also as mentioned on the panel, what are the benefits that Africa can help solve here? And then how do we create that bridge? Some of the industries, fintech, health tech, infrastructure, agri-tech, I'm mentioning tech, and our panelists mentioned the venture capitalist space. I think as we pour more capital into that, what it'll do is open up multiple industries and tap into the youth, not only here, but in the youth that's growing drastically in West Africa and other parts of Canada, other parts of Africa, I should say.
Awesome. Thank you for that. All right. So I'd like to transition this conversation by directing a question to Dr. Eleni. And we've had the opportunity to kind of highlight all of the acknowledged growth potential on the continent of Africa. And it's quite clear that African entrepreneurs and innovators have a real opportunity to address unmet needs and close particular gaps in the areas of infrastructure that was mentioned, healthcare, agriculture, and beyond. So as the founder of the Ethiopia Commodity Exchange and founder of Blue Moon, which is a top incubator in Ethiopia, and now as the Chief Innovation Officer with UNDP Africa, you've been able to see the impact of innovation directly firsthand. In what ways have you seen innovation operate as a driver for business growth in Africa? And how might investors take advantage of this opportunity?
Thank you, Sherry. Excellent question. Innovation, or let's even back up and say startups who are trying to change the world, disrupt the traditional ways of doing things, are doing so to solve problems. And those problems are everywhere. They are not just African problems, they are also global problems. As a planet, we're trying to figure out how to feed 9.5 billion people by 2050. I had a fantastic meeting yesterday with a young man, Egyptian Canadian, who has founded a company called Aspire that is using insect protein for food security, and so ideas abound everywhere, and there is no monopoly of where ideas arise. The only problem is whether those ideas fall on fertile ground, where they are nurtured and supported and financed, and that there's a whole ecosystem around them to take them somewhere, or whether they wither and die. And so what we're trying to do at UNDP in the Regional Bureau for Africa is to launch an initiative which we call Timbuktu. And you probably know Timbuktu as the glorious history of Africa, the nexus of trade and knowledge. And so we're trying to put up this initiative as a way to boost the innovation ecosystem across the continent, and to see now where those hotspots of innovation can be strengthened and can become Pan-African poles or centers of excellence. A single fintech company in Nigeria, Flutterwave, that is now valued at $3 billion, didn't exist 5 years ago. They are now transacting over $9 billion a year and enabling hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of small SMEs, small businesses, to use their payment platform to grow their own businesses. There are, I think, about 8 unicorns now in Africa. It's been astounding, especially 2021. 5 unicorns emerged just in 1 year, and we're hoping to see a few more this year. But the point is that each of those companies has, it's not just how many people they employ, and we tend to think, are they employing people? Is that our only metric of impact? But really, the enabling, the knock-on effects, the multiplier effects are massive. So what we're trying to do with Timbuktu is set up 8 Pan-African innovation hubs, each focused on a specific vertical. So agri-tech, fintech, health tech, edutech, tourism and trade tech, / logistics, smart cities, and I think I'm forgetting on creatives. And so the idea is that in Casablanca, Cairo, Lagos, Accra, Nairobi, Kigali, Cape Town, and Dakar, we would put up a hub in which there would be a center of African excellence in terms of a startup builder attracting startups from across the continent, and then paired with that, a startup fund, seed fund, focused again on that vertical where we would hope to attract capital from around the world. So this is the opportunity for me. This is where the puck is going for Canadian investors and Canadian venture capital, Canadian innovators, is to plug in with us, because this is a partnership model. This is not a UNDP project where we're all trying to do everything ourselves. By no means. In fact, this is absolutely private facing. We will be hoping to have partnerships with private sector to run those hubs, to invest in those funds, and to really see an explosion of talent and innovation on the continent. And I want to say one thing about the current amount of venture capital coming in. It's flowing, 83% of it is going to 4 countries: South Africa, Egypt, that's not in the right order, Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, and Egypt in order of ranking. So we need to spread this wave across the continent. This is a massive opportunity. We have a $90 billion investment gap in startups in Africa, and I think we're going to get there. So we're hoping to launch a $1 billion fund for the Timbuktu Fund, but I see that being leveraged much bigger, and we're hoping OCP is one of our partners.
Great, thank you. I think that leads nicely into some of the work that BKR Capital is doing. And Isaac, I understand that BKR Capital was able to close funding led by the Business Development Bank of Canada, Export Development Bank, and co-invested with the Quebec Deposit Investment Fund. So in addition to some other Canadian LPs, you're currently investing in great Canadian technology and technology-forward startups, but your organization has committed about 10% of funding to global outfits. So what do you believe Canadian businesses need to consider about investing in the clear growth opportunities available in markets on the African continent?
Yeah, great question. And, again, thank you to BDC, EDC, CDPQ, Scotiabank, RBC, and all the amazing Canadian institutions that took a chance on an opportunity that they saw here in Canada, but also what it's starting to do, it creates the first time institutional dollars is invested in a VC fund that also has an allocation outside Canada, specifically Africa and the continent. And we're excited with one of our first investments we made outside of Canada was a company called TRIPS. They're based in Nigeria. And what they're doing is targeting and providing a solution to a pain point that is impacting the public sector, the private sector, while encouraging the emerging local drivers. And that's around transportation and logistics. When we did the investment to TRIPS last year, they were just in Nigeria. Now they've expanded to Ghana and Uganda. And just last couple weeks ago, they had their over 2.5 million rides across those 3 regions and growing rapidly. And now we're helping them set up their Canadian corporation here so that there's a benefit not only to Canada, but also to the continent. This is one of many examples to how bridging institutions, the private sector, and the continent with representation, right? Because now we're looking at other companies that are looking to expand to North America from the continent, and then companies we're investing here that want to expand to the continent. So we're creating that bridge. There's a great company, can't announce yet, in the health tech space, in the fintech space. Again, the same thing. They're solving a problem that from Canada's perspective, we may not understand, but they're on the ground. And as you mentioned, collaboration is key. We're actually going to be announcing an entrepreneurship excellence center in Lagos. And the goal is to bridge that gap. A few months ago, Collision happened here in Toronto, one of the largest tech conference, and there were over 20 Nigerian founders that came to the conference, of which they were staying at our hotel by the airport. But what they did while they were here is build relationships with banks, build relationships with government, build relationships with other companies in their sectors. So we had health tech companies, and we try to connect the dots with them and sick kids and see what they could do with that institutions. We had ed tech companies, and we were connecting the dots with different universities. So now they could take best lessons learned, go back to the continent and start to continue to work on their business, but more importantly, build relationships with other VC funds here.
Great. Thank you for sharing that. So that makes me want to shift the conversation to you, Mr. Oliphant, in terms of getting your perspective from a policy perspective. So we know that the U.S. government recently published its Africa strategy, and it has been actively raising its profile in terms of its relationship with the African continent. However, some of the messaging may have fallen a bit flat and may not be resonating as intended. In what lessons, if any, can Canada take to ensure that we're clearly articulating our intentions and really to further strengthen relations?
Thank you, and it gives me a little chance to talk about our emerging Africa strategy that we are building. It starts at a different place than the American strategy. Obviously, we're a different scale, but we're also different in our approach. This will be a whole of continent approach as opposed to separating sub-Saharan from the Maghreb and North Africa. We're taking our cues from Africa in our strategy. And the first goal of the strategy, the marker of success will be, does Africa and do African countries see themselves in our strategy? That's the number one goal. The second goal will be, do Canadians see the opportunities in Africa? And that'll be, but it's the second goal. The first goal is to make sure that Africa and African countries and partners see themselves reflected. And we have an opportunity in Canada. We have 2 languages. We have English and French. That makes a huge difference in the continent, and we'll have to brush up a bit on Portuguese and other languages, but that makes a difference. We're also not a colonial power. We don't have those colonial vestiges, even the new colonialism of a US or a China or Russia or Turkey. We are seen as someone who will be respectful and engage at that level. The third marker will be, does it actually work? Is there robust activity that builds on what we're doing? Global Affairs works in 3 areas. We will continue with humanitarian assistance and development aid as long as there's poverty, as long as there's malnutrition, as long as there's inequality, as long as women and girls are behind men and boys, as long as there aren't appropriate health outcomes, we'll be there with humanitarian assistance and development. We'll also be there, though, in the longer term towards that 2063 goal with an economic cooperation strategy. That's about investment and development. That's about trade. And Mary Ng, the Minister of International Trade, is doing that work now in tandem with the work that I've been charged on the public policy side, on the foreign policy side, that will look at security. We'll look at the environment and climate change and the effects on the continent. We'll look at democracy and human rights and how we help institutions build so that businesses can see a frame that they can feel safe and good to do business in. That would be the role of the government. Development, trade commissioners, trade missions, but also helping countries in Africa develop those structures under an international rules-based order that says business can flourish. FIPAs, absolutely, the Foreign Investment Protection and Promotion Protection Agreements, absolutely are part of that. Stretching out into the regional economic communities, making our way there, but doing it with a Canadian modesty, not the way other countries might do it. So I am hopeful. We are engaging. The Canada-Africa Business Council is a key partner. We also have diaspora in Canada, and they're not on the sidelines. They need to be front and center on this project, because people help build those bridges. And if it's someone who has Ethiopian background or Malawian background or South African background, we want you. And help us understand the context and the opportunities and the challenges. So I think it will be successful, inshallah.
Okay. So it sounds really exciting and an opportunity for Canada to articulate its positioning. So when might we anticipate this emerging African strategy?
Well, let's get Indo-Pacific out. I'm looking at Goldy on that one. That's the latest one. I am hoping that there will be, I want to get it right. And it needs to be right-sized, right-timed, and fit into that framework of up to 2063, which is the African Union's framework of their goals. And so I'm not making a promise. I am hoping to have something to Cabinet by the end of the year, end of this calendar year, and next year have something that folks can see. But you'll be hearing about it from me before then, because it needs to be iterative. It will change as you tell me what you think it needs to be.
Well, I look forward to being able to engage with that, and thank you so much for sharing. All right, so I'd love to actually direct this question to Goldy. As you illuminated that in February 2020, so just before the pandemic came to engage itself with our lives, your organization, the Business Council of Canada, published a report on the importance of building Canada's economic ties to the African continent. So I'll just, if I can, plug your report. It's called Why Africa. I encourage everyone who's interested in doing business, especially Canadian businesses who are interested in doing business on the continent, to read that report. And that report identified that Canadian businesses have been under-exporting to 10 of the high-growth economies on the continent. In particular, the impact of that is they're under-exporting at around 40%, as illuminated in the report, below what's expected. The anticipated shortfall of that is just over $750 million USD. This is significant. So where do you see synergies between Canadian businesses and investors and opportunities on the African continent?
Well, look, let me just tell everybody that the report's available at thebusinesscouncil.ca. So if you want to have a look at it, I'm going to highlight some of the points here for those of you who like lists. I'll just give you the top line. But as I said, the world is changing. And so we need to revisit and reassess where we have lagged behind, because you're right, we have lagged behind. There's been an effort under Rob and his government's leadership, the preceding government's leadership, to diversify. We've even had a minister for trade diversification, who I interviewed on this chair at this forum a few years ago, Jim Carr. So there's an effort afoot, but now you need to act. So our recommendations, and I had a big list here, so I had to write it down, but here's what we said, first and foremost, for business. So those of you who are in business. One, you've got to identify the niche market opportunities. You've got to be specific. You just can't go to Africa. You've got to figure out where the opportunities are. Two, you have to invest in local representation. And this is another one of those old analogies, right? All politics is local, so is all business. And you've got to be on the ground, and you've got to make that investment. You've got to develop the talent. This is the single biggest issue around the world for CEOs today, is where do I get my talent? And you got to nurture it. You got to develop it. And there's so much opportunity in countries within Africa because of your age of your population. making that investment will generate return, not just in Africa, but more likely as these people move around the world. It'll be a global impact to find the talent. So invest in that talent. Proactively manage your risk. There's risk everywhere. You can't just freeze. Right now, there's $200 billion worth of capital in Canadian corporations. It's not a unique phenomenon. Worldwide, businesses are frozen because they're watching the world change in front of them. Geopolitical risk, lack of predictability, lack of stability, political interference and regulatory processes. All of these things create a chill, right? So if you can respond to that and say, well, not in Africa. In Africa, we welcome the capital. In Africa, we give you some confidence, we give you stability, and we give you some reassurance. We give you the capacity to build things. There are very few countries left in the world where we can build things anymore without all kinds of delays. Right? So make Africa attractive as a magnet, because one of the things about Africa that I think is the great story is you can leapfrog there. You don't have to transition anything. You can build the things from scratch because there's nothing there in some cases, right? So it's a tremendous opportunity to have your capital utilized for good purpose and good outcome without having to invest in restorations or renovations or so forth. Just build it from scratch. That's a great opportunity. Think long term. I think there's too much short term thinking in the world, but think long term as business leaders. So there's your top line on the business side. Very quickly on the government side, I'm delighted to hear what Rob had to say, and I would like to hold him in very high regard, and the work that he's doing comes from a very good place. But we need to get the strategy out. Just like we need to get the Indo-Pacific strategy out, I'm encouraged that that strategy will come out soon, because businesses look to their governments to say, where are you putting your emphasis? Where are you putting our resources? We will come with you. We will be a partner. Let's bring back some of those Team Canada missions that seem to have disappeared. Because when you go abroad, government has to be sort of at the table with business. It's a great partnership to enter any market, let alone a market that is as complicated as Africa is. So that's one. Two, prioritize your high-level visit to the African countries, right? So we released our report in February 2020 because the Prime Minister was in Africa in 2020. Right? It was latched onto the attention that was being given to it. Four, I guess. Three, ensure success of the Continental Free Trade Agreement, because it's one thing to have it, it's another thing to show that it works. Right? So make sure that it works. And this is item 4, is we think or within item 3 is Canadian government and Canadian public servants, Canadian trade negotiators are amongst the most respected around the world. I mean, we help the British how to do free trade agreements so they can negotiate back with us how to do one. Let's make sure that as you're implementing your free trade agreement, if you run across some challenges and problems in terms of its integrity, in terms of its ability to do what it says it's going to do, I think Canadian government, Canadian public officials, who, as I said, are amongst the finest free trade negotiators in the world, can help to make sure that the potential of that continental agreement is realized. And then lastly, for government, I would just say, and it was already been stated on the panel, but negotiate FIPA. Get that investment promotion and investment protection in place, because what the business community around the world is looking for is confidence that comes from policies, regulatory frameworks that are predictable, that are stable, to operate in societies where there is social cohesion, where there's respect for ESG and CSR. Money's never been more mobile. Talent has never been more mobile. So make yourself a magnet for that capital and that talent, and the rest will come.
Great. Thank you so much. I loved what you had to say about, politics are local, but also business is local. And I think, Mehdi, that ties nicely into thinking about OCP as a partner for Canadian businesses. So OCP Africa has identified its ambition to successfully transform business in Africa and represent the model of development of Africa for Africa. How would you envision engaging the global market and Canada more specifically in this effort?
I think that to work sustainably on the continent, we should be on mid-term approach, not on short-term approach. We can identify some short-term quick opportunities, but we should work structurally on the mid-term. And we try to do this at OCP Group and OCP Africa with all the partners that are willing to do it, local partners and international partners, by working on different phases. First one, we are not just a supplier of fertilizer, but we work on R&D with local universities, with international universities, to develop first solutions that are sustainable, that will fit to the needs of the different soils, the different crops, and the different agroecological conditions. By doing so, and by developing these specific solutions that will be sustainable, that will make the agriculture be developed sustainably, we put it on the field by bringing also different initiatives that are farmer-centric, because most of the farmers in the continent, 70% of them are smallholder farmers. They have piece of land between 0.5 to 2 hectares. So, and they have several bottlenecks. So to develop the market, we are trying to work with partners to debottleneck all the issue holistically of those farmers. First one, accessibility to quality inputs, certified seeds, quality fertilizers, small mechanization. Even if he has this quality input, he should know how to use it. So then we bring a training program, capacity building program to empower the farmer to make him use these inputs in the best way and with a sustainable approach. Then, even if we have the inputs, the training, we should ensure the offtake, because if he cannot sell at a fair price his product, he will not be encouraged the year after to invest. So we bring also the off-taker, and by doing this, we develop a virtual ecosystem, and the banks is willing to come and to finance, because we are de-risking the project, and also we are trying to onboard micro-insurance. So this is the global approach. We also work with government in the, comprehensive value chain. For example, with the government of Côte d'Ivoire, we work on the value chain of rice, because the country is producing 1.2 million tons of rice, and he's consuming 2.2. So he still import 1 million when there is everything to produce rice in the country, but there is some bottlenecks in terms of seed production, in terms of investment in the transformation of rice, in terms of logistic, and we are working in partnership approach. We are trying to build, let's say, an alliance with different partners. Each one will come and invest in his part of the value chain, and by doing so, it de-risk the investment for the others, because it will be coherent investment and comprehensive investment. Companies have a key role to play and are invited to come and to join this effort in the different countries with the public institutions, the private institutions, and the local ecosystem. And we have some good examples of collaboration at OCP with Canadian institutions. We are working, for example, in a region that is suffering from aridity in Morocco, or Hamna, not very far from Ben Guerir and Marrakesh, for the introduction of a special variety of quinoa that is adapted to this agroecological condition, and that is, will support the food security. And we do this with IDRC, Canadian IDRC, and with UM6P, the Moroccan university. We have also signed a partnership with Fertilizer Canada and APNI for the dissemination of the 4R nutrient approach in all these development programs and in this training that are given to farmers. But I think we can do much more together.
Great. Thank you. And thank you for sharing the opportunities, tangible opportunities about opportunities for collaboration and experiences. And it's always great to have those kinds of examples. So unfortunately, we're getting to the opportunity we need to close. I probably could ask you many more questions, but I'll ask you one that I think will be really helpful to the audience. And really that's about tangible actions, similar to some that Mehdi kind of articulated. And for time constraints, I'll just ask if each of you could share perhaps one tangible action that you believe should be taken to ensure that we actually move the dial on strengthening the investment and trade relationship between the Canadian market and markets on the African continent. So can I start with you, Isaac, maybe to share one tangible action?
Yeah, I think one tangible, and the government's already doing it, institutions are already doing it, is pouring more capital into the venture capital space. I think by doing that, it opens up a huge market and it tackles multiple industries, and there's a massive ripple effect by doing that.
Thank you. Mehdi?
I think I will just repeat what have been said, but I think there is, each country is different. There is not one Africa, but there is African countries. If you take just a region, for example, a region where I was living in Addis, the countries of East Africa are completely different from one to another in terms of culture, economy, politics, mindset. Everything is different. So it's important to understand very well each one and to spend enough time and to have enough resources to understand these specificities. And I think Canada, and it has been said by His Excellency, but has a great opportunity to leverage on the diaspora. Because the diaspora will be the bridge, the link between Canada and this local ecosystem in these different countries.
The one thing I would say is showing up. And it has to do with high-level visits. It has to do with low-level visits, medium-level visits. It is politicians, trade missions. We've had 5 or 6 countries covered through more virtual trade missions, particularly on women entrepreneurs. But we need to have delegations from Canada go to learn and to share. So showing up. We just have to be on the continent, in those countries. Every region is different, absolutely agreed. Every country is different. You have to get the nuance. You can't get it from Canada. We have to be there.
Exactly.
Eleni.
I would say 2 things, even though I was supposed to say one, which is de-risking. And I think that's where government can play a very big role on the development aid side, is, enabling this ecosystem to flourish through de-risking investment. And then on the second, and it's already been said, but bridging, bringing Canadian companies together with African startups, bringing youth from Africa into exchange programs. There will be so much, I think, that we will see between Canada on the low level in terms of the bridging that would happen between the communities.
And we'll end with you, Goldy.
So I would just say speed. The world is completely realigning. Supply chains are being redefined. And if you're not a part of it now, you won't be a part of it in the future. So acting with speed, acting with ambition, acting with urgency is critical. And one of the ways to do that, and I'm sneaking in too, is tell your stories better. Success is an aphrodisiac. The more we talk about the successes in Africa, the more people will say, I want to be a part of it. And I think it was striking to me how little we talked about the things we used to talk about with Africa. So that's progress.
Great.
Read.
Thank you all for joining us on this panel. Thank you to the panelists for sharing your insights and valuable insights and actions, which I hope all of you will be taking away as you consider your own strategic plans. And we appreciate your attendance. Thank you.